Hey, welcome everybody to our live at Hope for Our Times. Listen, today I have an incredible guest, who hasn't been here in a while, and he's back with us today. One of the best guests that we could ever have on our program. And we're going to talk about what's really happening here. Some things about Israel that I don't think virtually anybody is talking about. And also this right here, indoctrinating our children to death. We're going to get into that with our guest, Alex Newman. And Alex is an award-winning international journalist, educator, author, speaker, investor, radio host, and consultant. His mission is to glorify God in everything he does. He holds the position of president at Liberty Sentinel Media, a media and information consulting firm, and his writing portfolio spans a diverse range of publications, both in the U.S. and internationally. He currently serves as a contributor to Epoch Times, correspondent for the Law Enforcement Intelligence Brief, and the senior editor for New American Magazine, writer for WorldNet Daily, and a whole lot of others, the George Magazine, Freedom Project Media. I could go on and on. Also contributor on, including Fox, Newsmax, OAN, Real America's Voice, dare I say it, even CNN. Got to bring sense to CNN, which is not easy to do. Alex, there's so many things to talk about. Thank you for joining us today.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much, Tom. And you know what I always say is, if the devil himself gave me a megaphone and allowed me the opportunity to say something through it, I would tell everybody the truth. So I'll go on. And even these fake media outlets, I know they're vile. I know they hate God, but if they'll give me the opportunity to share truth with their viewers, I'll do it. And, just today I had a column published in Newsweek, which, Newsweek is not exactly my kind of magazine, but they were willing to have me write a piece about education. And, hey, they got a lot of readers that need to know this stuff. So that's why I'm not a big fan of a lot of these publications and media outlets. But, their readers, their viewers need the truth, too. So
absolutely. In fact, I think it's great that you do go on those. And that Newsweek would publish something you wrote. Is pretty cool. And it even reminds me, we've talked about this before, you've attended the COP meetings over the years, the climate meetings over the years, and I remember asking you probably about a year or two ago, do they know what you do, Alex? Why would they let someone like you into their meetings exposing what's really going on? But they do, and it's great as long as God keeps opening those doors. Bring the truth to where the truth needs to go. It's the light that exposes the darkness. And I think it's just terrific. Hey,
Thank you, Tom. I agree with you 100%. We need Christians in all these places, and unfortunately, these UN conferences are some of the darkest places you could imagine. There's almost nobody there to tell the world the truth about what's going on, or to speak the truth there. So that's why we do our best to get to those when we can.
I think it's great. Hey, I want to comment on this before we get going here. Just some of the endorsements you have on this latest book, and folks, this is a book that I would highly encourage you to get. We do have it in our store, hopefortimes.com. But Kirk Cameron, one of your endorsements, Dr. Peter McCullough, General Michael Flynn, Pete Hegseth, Alex Jones. You've been on Alex's program before, too. Greg Hunter, Dr. James Lindsay. I mean, this list is huge. It just goes on and on. Bill Federer, who I had on here just last week. Bill is such a great brother. Trevor Loudon. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North. For those of you who are as old as me, you remember the Oliver North from the 1980s, back when Reagan was president. You have Clay Clark is in here. Allison Steinberg, I want to give her a shout out at OAN. I know she's become a good friend of yours and a friend of mine, and she is really toeing the line out there on the mainstream media and bringing the truth. Curtis Bowers you have. I mean, this list is huge of all the different endorsements, and it's just an outstanding book. And I want to get to some of these things because I think this should be in the hand of anybody that is an American and is thinking, hey, we're moving forward, and we got to know what's going on. But before we even get there, big news in Israel. I think to help understand, we've watched what's going on with Iran. We watched the rockets. the threats of war and rumors of war, they're escalating. But the UN's involvement, and as we're talking about indoctrinating our children to death, Alex, you have some info on that I think you need to share with everybody.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction, Tom, and thank you for mentioning those endorsements. I was actually really surprised about the endorsements too, because the book is kind of, radical, I guess, by today's standards. I'm really calling for an entirely new way of thinking when it comes to education. So I sent emails to, maybe 50 people that I know pretty well, that I know kind of think like me on things. And I expected to get a handful back. I think I got back like 47. There was a handful of people who didn't have time to write endorsements. So I was blown away that so many people were willing to attach their name to something that, really I'm calling for us to radically reform our thinking when it comes to education. Stop thinking like the world, start thinking like a Christian. And education really is such a critical issue. I actually think it's inescapably intertwined with the issue of discipleship, and the devil knows that, and the people who want to wipe Israel off the map know that. And so over 10 years ago, I started reporting on this. There's a UN agency called the UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Administration, very, very friendly with Hamas. It's so ridiculous that Trump actually defunded them when he came into power. And I was writing 10 years ago about how this UN agency was creating a bunch of ridiculous textbooks teaching little Arab children that it was their duty to wage perpetual war on the Jews, and you get from the river to the sea, you got to be free and all this stuff. So what did they think was going to happen when they brainwashed a bunch of little Arab children to believe that these mean old Jews had come and stole their country and things like that? Well, they knew what was going to happen. They knew that this would produce terrorism. They knew that this would produce violence. They knew that this would produce anti-Semitism and Jew hatred and more war against Israel, and yet they did it anyway. And unfortunately, it's something that we see all over the world, that the textbooks, the school systems are indoctrinating children against God, against the truth, against the Bible. And when it's the UN doing it, you would think, the U.S. government likes to pretend that they're so pro-Israel, at least they used to. And yet, at the same time, you're giving tens of billions of dollars to Islamic governments that are openly sworn to wiping Israel off the face of the earth. You're giving who knows how many hundreds of millions of dollars to international organizations like the UNRWA to brainwash little Arab children that they should wage perpetual war on Jews. Tell me again about how pro-Israel you are, right? I mean, it's utter foolishness, but they understand very well, if you want this war to go on forever, if you want the next generation of Arab children to also hate the Jews and want to wipe them off the face of the earth, the way to do it is to brainwash them while they're young, and that's exactly what they're doing.
And with brainwashing them, this is coming from the UN themselves. They're brainwashing the Arab children to hate the Jews. And we have brainwashing going on in America. By the way, Alex, so I know you know this, but you look at the UN, Iran sits as the chair on the UN's disarmament panel, whatever that means. Iran, of all things. We want to make sure everybody's disarmed. Yeah, Iran. That just shows you the bent that they have and the wickedness that is really there. But I want to go to America, and I want to bring this up because, Alex, there's a lot of people that are Christian that say, hey, we shouldn't even be involved in something like this in politics or whatever. But I look at, we have a problem with righteousness. What's happened is, and a lot of pastors have bought into it, a lot of people that are on social media like this have bought into it, and they'll say, well, we don't get involved in politics, we only get involved in the Bible. Well, listen, the problem is these things are biblical that we deal with. It's righteousness versus wickedness. And the media or the left has turned it into politics, whether it be abortion or gender or whatever it is, and so people won't even talk about it. Alex, I believe we need to fight back, and I look what's going on and what's happening to our children, and as what's happened over in Israel, as you mentioned with the UN, indoctrinating the children there. Here in America, it's indoctrinating the children to death, and I'm going to have you walk us through this because, quite frankly, I don't think, even as insane as things have become, I don't think a lot of parents and grandparents that even study the Bible and maybe go to church are really understand the depth of wickedness that is taking place and how America's being not just transformed, but it's already been transformed. And it's just getting worse. So I'm going to start at the top. And with this book, What caused you to write this book?
Well, I appreciate it, Tom. And you're right. Education should never have become a political issue, right? Education is a Bible issue. It's a biblical issue. The Bible is filled with instructions on how parents are to educate, disciple, and raise their children. And I always challenge people who say, oh, that's a political thing. We don't get it. Oh, could you please show me the chapter and verse that says hand your children over to Caesar to be taught climate change, gender theory? There's no such thing. This should never have become a political issue. We never should have given the responsibility over the education and the discipleship of our children to a political entity. This was always a parental responsibility. It never should have been delegated to government. There's a role for the church there in education, and historically there has been that really exploded during the Reformation. But the idea that the government should be educating children is a very new idea. It's an idea that was concocted by God-hating, God-denying, God-ridiculing, godless Marxists, communists. And I don't say those things as terms of insulting. It's just what they were. And if you read their writings, they make that very, very clear. So if you go back and look at how we got in this mess, not following God's instructions for how we raise and disciple our children, I believe is the single most important factor here. We never should have trusted them with our children. We never should have handed them over. We never should have stopped using God's word as our model, as our guide for how we bring up our children. And so now we need to make this not a political issue by returning to what God has commanded when it comes to raising and discipling and educating the next generation.
I looked at your book, and I'm going to ask you this in just a second. When did we start to see the school system change, or how did we get, what was the decision on the public school system, which is really government, it's a government system. It's like, it's a different way of indoctrinating your children. We say it's public, it's for your good, like they say with everything else, but it really is like the Babylonian system that has come right into our own homes, in our own school districts. But before we go there, I want to encourage everybody, if you live in the Temecula area of Southern California, listen carefully. There is Dr. Joseph Komorski. He's on the school board in Temecula. Great young man who is bringing righteousness and truth, and it has really bothered the powers that be in the state of California. And right now they are doing everything they can in the state of California to overturn the election, to recall him from that board. Listen, he needs your support. And this is one of the ways you stand up for righteousness. You got to get involved. We've got to be salt and light in the world, and we can't sit back and do nothing and saying, well, I'm just going to be a silent witness, or I shouldn't be involved, or what, I can't make a difference. Folks, this battle is in the school districts, and this wickedness that's going on, and we can't stand by and see what's happening to our children. And folks, one of the things that Dr. Joseph stood up for and stands up for, as a parent's right to know if their child wants to go through a transition or is being indoctrinated into a transition by leaders within the school district. It's just wickedness. There's money behind it. If you're in Temecula, please, folks, get out and support Dr. Joseph. It is a huge deal. It is a huge deal. All right, so with that, Alex, let's work on through this. You can say anything you want. So you have, how'd this start? Go ahead.
So the story of how we got here is unbelievably fascinating, Tom, and virtually nobody knows the story. That's actually one of the reasons I decided to write the book, is because the history of how we got here is almost entirely obscure. Virtually nobody knows it. And I start with, what did education look like before the government took over? People don't realize, because we don't have a point of reference anymore. We're several generations into this. We don't even know what education used to look like. I encourage Americans to spend a little time looking at what we had before the government took over. We were the best educated society that had ever existed in human history, the most literate, the most moral, the most Christian nation that had ever existed on this planet. We had almost 100% literacy in our big cities, 95, 96% plus in the more rural areas, all before we had government schools. Even in the 1830s, right as government school ideas were just starting to percolate, you had Alexis de Tocqueville came over here from France. He was astounded by what an amazing country America was, and he said virtually all education is really in the hands of families, and whatever's not in the hands of families is in the hands of the Protestant clergy. That was before the massive Catholic migration. So all education basically was families, and to the extent that they needed some help, it was the church that would step in and help there. So you go back to the very beginning, the Pilgrims, the Puritans passed the first law. It was the Old Deluder Satan Act. And what they said basically was Satan wants to hide the scriptures from people. And so we need to make sure everybody in this colony knows how to read. And so they set up basically church schools and commanded that every child in that colony learn how to read. There was no government school system. Really, there were church schools. And their instruction was to just make sure people could read so that they could read the Bible. Of course, the Bible was the primary textbook. And that's what we had for a few hundred years in this country. Then along comes a guy called Robert Owen. And actually, he makes up the first chapter of the book. He's almost unknown today, very influential at the time. And he was a man who rejected God. He was a man who rejected biblical principles, including the basic ones like thou shalt not steal. He rejected the institution of family. He was a communist before communism was cool, before Karl Marx came along, set up this ridiculous communist commune in Indiana that failed after less than 2 years because, of course, communism is dumb. It goes against God's order, and so it fails. And he concluded the real solution to making sure it would work is that we need the government to educate children. And we know quite a lot about this just from the obscure historical record. We know that according to a whistleblower, Orestes Brownson, he set up a secret society, is how the whistleblower described it, modeled on the Carbonari in Europe, a nasty secret society in Italy, that was dedicated to the idea that the government should educate children. So he said on the surface, they were trying to change public opinion and trying to get men elected to legislatures who would support the government getting involved in schools. But he says in his revelation on what he learned as part of the secret society, he said the great object was to get rid of Christianity. Imagine that, the first guy to seriously propose that the government ought to educate your kids, his goal was to get rid of Christianity because he knew you couldn't have this communist utopian paradise as long as people were attached to the idea of family, attached to private property, attached to God's moral commands. So that did not actually take root in America for a few decades after that. But the Prussian ambassador got a hold of these essays he was writing about how the government should educate children. He took them to the dictator of Prussia, and according to Robert Owen's autobiography, the dictator so much approved of these ideas that he ordered his interior minister to create the first ever system of education of the state, by the state, and for the state. This is early to mid 1800s. So this system is studied by a guy called Horace Mann, another God-hating, God-rejecting humanist. They didn't use that term at the time. Unitarian was his preferred term. So you reject the Trinity, and it's not long before you're embracing all kinds of ridiculousness. So he imports that system from Prussia into Massachusetts. Really interesting. And right away, disaster in Massachusetts. And then he leaves his post. He becomes the first ever Secretary of Education for any state. And he starts traveling around the country. The guy's like an evangelist. He's going around preaching to legislatures the good news of salvation through government schools. And he's telling them, we'll get rid of 90% of the crimes. And it's just going to be so wonderful if we just pry those kids from their parents and put them in public schools. They weren't proposing anything like what we have today, 9-10 months, godlessness, transgenderism. It wasn't anything like that. It was just a very limited program. But that was the genesis of it. And by the time the First World War comes along, every state has now established some sort of government involvement in education. Some public school systems. And when World War I comes along, the men are sent off to go die in Europe. The women are pushed into the factories because the men, instead of working in the factories, are dying in Europe. And all these children suddenly don't have supervision. So the government says, don't worry, we'll educate your kids for you. And that is actually, Tom, the first time in American history where most American children are in the hands of government in public schools. And of course, it's all downhill from there. John Dewey kind of seizes on this architecture that Horace Mann laid down. For those who don't know John Dewey, he was a huge admirer of the Soviet Union. I talked about him at our Eagle Forum conference. He actually invented a new religion. Him and a few dozen of his buddies created the Humanist Manifesto. I encourage people to read it. Right at the beginning, they tell you, we religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. which of course contradicts the Bible. In the beginning, God created. And, they just go on from there. It's basically communism, get rid of private property, get rid of the profit motive. So he told us what he believed religiously. He told us what he believed politically. He was a communist. He was a humanist. And yet he is almost universally acknowledged as the founding father of America's public school system. So what did Christian parents think was going to happen when they handed their children over for 5 days a week to a system based on the ideas of a God-hating humanist who rejects even the existence of God, much less the rest of the truths of the Bible? So it's been a disaster ever since. And we're now 4 generations into this experiment. Our children are killing themselves. It's literally one of the leading causes of death among children. It is the leading cause in some age groups of children. They're chopping off their private parts. They're dumber than they've ever been in our history. No exaggeration. Less than 1/3 of them are even proficient in anything, according to the government's own data. And it all goes back to these God-hating, God-rejecting communists who wanted to brainwash your kids.
So this is John Dewey of the Dewey Decimal System, correct?
No, that was a different Dewey, believe it or not. Both kind of involved in these circles. But John Dewey, the architect of the public school system, his big claim to fame was education and philosophy. He was a big-time progressive. And then, of course, the other Dewey, he's the one who figured out how to properly organize libraries.
So two completely different, different Deweys.
Yep.
Good. That's good to know. But we look at this, think, okay, this is the foundation of the American public school system. It's Marxism. So it's no surprise that we have the Department of Education, which really is Marxist and out to destroy your children. Here in California, we just have a nightmare of a situation. When you talk to teachers, they think, well, they can't do anything. They're stuck in the union. Listen, I know a lot of teachers that are believers in Christ, but they feel like they're tied. They can't do anything else, but they actually can. But going through this, you have Frankfurt School weaponized the U.S. school, U.S. education system against U.S. education against civilization. What's the Frankfurt School?
So the Frankfurt School is a group of communists who are operating out of Frankfurt. And this is a fascinating story. A lot of anti-communists are familiar with these guys, but they don't know necessarily the incredibly significant role they played in education. So they set up the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt at the University of Frankfurt-Goethe. And the idea was, it was actually a project of the Comintern, the Communist International. They had met about a decade before and come up with this idea. They figured out, long story short, that Marx was wrong. And they wouldn't have put it that way, but they understood that after enough decades of trying that the workers were not going to rise up and murder their bosses. They just weren't, right? Germans and Americans, they were making good wages. They had a nice vacation. They had a car in the driveway. They really weren't interested in revolution. So these evildoers acknowledged, all right, Marx was wrong, although they didn't publicly say that. We need a new strategy. And that's where the Frankfurt School comes in. Their idea was to try to infiltrate all the institutions and gradually break down the culture. So they wanted to infiltrate the churches. They wanted to infiltrate education. A lot of these ideas also came from Antonio Gramsci, a very well-known communist writer from Italy. Now, their worldview was actually not all that different from the National Socialists, the Hitler followers. They were international socialists. Hitler was the leader of the National Socialist Party, but they had some disagreements on, the racial stuff and the religion angle. And so they ended up leaving Germany and coming for the United States. They were actually brought here by John Dewey. Imagine that. And the Rockefellers. I neglected to mention when I talked about John Dewey, he partnered with John D. Rockefeller. John D. Rockefeller gave him $3.1 million to set up an experimental school at the University of Chicago, graduated a bunch of kids who couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't do math, and couldn't tell right from wrong. They said, that will be perfect. That's what we need for the whole country. So, Dewey was a communist. Rockefeller was a super capitalist, but they had this common vision of a dumbed down mass of the population that could be conned out of its liberties. Rockefeller just wanted people who could turn the screw and work at the factory without philosophizing or asking too many questions. Dewey wanted people who were dumbed down enough to give up their freedoms and their heritage and move into a communist utopia. So Dewey and Rockefeller teamed up and brought all of these Frankfurt School characters over to the United States. A lot of them landed at Columbia University, a teacher's college, where John Dewey took up his post, again, with help from the Rockefellers. Others went out to, the University of California. Some of them went out to Chicago. And they actually were the ones who injected a lot of these poisonous ideas into academia. One of their big things was the authoritarian father. They acted like American dads were these terrible tyrants who were oppressing their wives and oppressing their children. And we just needed to dismantle the patriarchy, because they knew dads were the ones protecting their families. Dads were the ones who didn't want their kids brainwashed with this stuff. Dads were the ones protecting their wives and their children from the evils of Satan and the world, right? So they came after dads. They put a big, giant target on men, especially fathers and husbands. But really, they started injecting all this filth into our culture. You may have heard of Herbert Marcuse. He's one of the guys who really dealt in the entertainment and the communications media to try to pervert American culture. So these guys were actual communist revolutionaries, and they understood education is the key. So the bulk of them actually went into academia and then K through 12 education.
Wow, it's so fascinating. When you look at the dumbing down of the American male, you start looking at sitcoms over the last several years. Remember back to the days of Archie Bunker, and then you fast forward from there. I don't think it's a coincidence that Archie Bunker's his son-in-law on the program happens to be one of the biggest Marxists that we have in Hollywood right now. I can't even think of what his name is. But we look at that guy, or we look at the whole program from there, from the days of All in the Family, and we fast forward, you start looking what's happened to the American male, even in TV, in movies, and people are so offended by anybody who's got a little bit of machoism in them. And by the way, again, everybody, this book is available in the Hope for Our Times store. I want to encourage you to check it out. It's Rob Reiner. He was the one who was on there with, man, is he a Marxist? He seems just set to bring down America. I want to ask you what people can do about homeschool in just a second. If they can't, if they aren't able to homeschool their kids, I want to ask you about that in a minute. But I want to ask you about these things that are in your book, the Common Core. How do we get to this nonsense of the Common Core, Big Brother, and then sex education that we have now? It's just insane. I mean, but when I go back, I was in high school in the 1970s. When I go back then, I remember there was some pretty crazy stuff going on 50 years ago. I mean, now it's just, it's unbelievable because you're talking about kindergartners and even younger. But so I started with a lot there. So Common Core. Just nuts. How do people even think some of the things I've seen with Common Core even make any sense? And why do we have it?
Yeah, so Common Core it represents the most dumbed down standards we've ever had, but it's far more significant than just dumbing down your children. And you can prove empirically it's dumbing down the children. In fact, the federal government knows this. They commissioned a study from a group called CSAIL that found the negative effects of Common Core are profound. They're getting worse and worse. We haven't even hit the bottom yet. We don't know where the bottom is. So they know it's dumbing you down. They knew it was going to dumb us down before they even implemented it. They had two subject matter experts, and I know them. They're nice enough people. I serve on a board with the lady who was the English expert, Dr. Sandra Stotsky. Really nice lady, but she said, I'm not going to sign off on this. This is going to dumb down the children. You're reducing their critical thinking. They're going to hate reading even if they could read. So I'm not signing off on this. The math expert, Dr. Amazing, they only had two subject matter experts, one in English, one in math. The math expert, Dr. James Milgram of Stanford, said, I'm not signing off on this. This is the most dumbed down math I've ever seen. He said some of it's even based on incorrect math. And so, of course, they mandated it in all 50 states. You know, forget what your legislature or your fake media told you. This is being taught in all 50 states. But it's much worse than just the dumbing down of our children, Tom. And I want to mention two things here that I think will really help drive this point home. First of all, it's the first ever time that we had a concerted public effort to have a national education system in the United States. Now, they had been working toward this goal quietly for decades, but they hadn't ever come out and boldly said, all the children across America need to learn the same thing, right? Forget your local school board, forget your state legislature. The bureaucrats in D.C. will be making these decisions for you. So this was a hugely significant event. It's actually what got me involved in writing about education to begin with. Secondly, and this may be even more significant than that, is the globalization component. So everybody knows that Bill Gates of hell was the one responsible for Common Core, him and the governor and the federal government, the governors and the federal government. What less people know is that in 2004, he went over to UNESCO headquarters. UNESCO is the UN Education Agency. He signed an agreement on behalf of Microsoft that they were going to create global education standards, global teacher training programs, global education curricula, and also the technology to make it all possible. Well, he did. As soon as he got back from that meeting, he started pouring millions of dollars into so-called education, into what we call today Common Core. He ended up putting $2.3 billion into it. And then they started buying ads where they were bragging that Common Core, and I've got the ads. I showed one of them at the Eagle Forum Summit we just did recently. They were bragging that Common Core aligns America's education system with the international standards that are now being pursued all over the world. So I want to bring this home for Christians because, ladies and gentlemen, this has profound implications. And I don't mean to sound alarmist or even to scare you, but the fact is your children are being prepared to live under a satanic, one-world, antichrist government. And the schools are doing the preparing. And you can demonstrate that this has been the agenda from the start. So you look at the folks at the UN that are running education, the UNESCO, the father of global education is a guy by the name of Robert Mueller. So he created what's called the World Core Curriculum. Okay, so really, really significant document. He said it should be taught to every child in the world, that it should be taught in every school in the world, and it is very new age, very occult, etc. And then in the foreword to the teacher's manual, which I have, he says that the underlying philosophy upon which this World Core Curriculum is based is found in the teachings of Alice Bailey by the Tibetan teacher Djwhal Khul. And so, that means nothing to most people. I actually have one of her primary books on education right here. It's called Education in the New Age by Alice Bailey. It is absolutely bonkers. People who really want to dig into this should read this book. But, just by telling you who Alice Bailey is, you probably get a sense of what's going on here. Alice Bailey was the founder of the Lucifer Publishing Company. Okay, it's still around today. They are preparing the world for the Antichrist. Go read their documents. They're preparing the world for this one world religious system. Biblical Christianity is the obstacle to be removed. She talks about the great heresy of separateness, right? That's us, because we don't want to be part of this world system. We want to be a part. We want to be holy, like our God called us to be holy. And so in this book, Education in the New Age, she said the schools really need to get children ready for world citizenship in a world government. Now, Alice Bailey claimed to be communicating with these spiritual entities, and actually Robert Mueller mentioned one of them, the Tibetan Djwhal Khul, in that statement. Well, these are spiritual entities that Alice Bailey described as ascended masters who she said she was channeling to write these absolutely ridiculous books. And of course, if you read your Bible, they're not ascended masters or any such nonsense. They are demons. And this is something that you find, I know non-Christians think, oh, wow, that's kind of crazy. Well, even if you're a non-Christian, you should recognize that it's kind of crazy that a lady who claimed to be talking to spirits is the one who came up with the underlying philosophy for the global education system. But ladies and gentlemen, this is what's happening. The schools are preparing your children for a satanic one-world system, and you don't even have to dig that deep to find out.
Yeah, that's absolutely what I believe, that the world's being conditioned. So when we look at what's going on with gender, listen, just common sense tells you there's a boy and a girl, a male and female. The plant world believes that. You take your dog to the vet, the vet doesn't ask you, well, what gender? Are you sure it's a male or female? Couldn't it be one of the 100 other genders that are out there? It doesn't even cross their minds. We are being conditioned, and that's why it's taking place at such a young age. The university system has already been turned over to the devil, as far as I can see. So now it is conditioning. There's mass delusion, deception that is taking place. These things are demonic. And by the way, it's just not that. Alex, you talk about a lot of different things. On OAN with Allison Steinberg, you were talking about just recently, it was regarding digital IDs. And you said they have been pushed for many years by Bill Gates, Bill Gates of hell. I've been quoting that lately, thank you. Rockefeller Dynasty and other known organizations to overthrow human liberty and prosperity. You've also talked with Allison about many other things, the protests going on in Israel or against the Jews and so forth. But we look at all of these different dynamics, and the world is being prepared, and this is not an accident that is taking place. And I got to tell you, for any parent or grandparent that's out there, it's understanding what is happening to your children. And there might be some really good teachers at your school, but a lot of the teachers that are out there, they feel like their hands are tied. Some of them have already lost their jobs, or they've quit because they wouldn't put up with it. And as they go away, guess who replaces them? People that are going to go along with the system. But in this book also, you do deal with technology too. where you have another chapter, Big Brother schools using big data to manipulate and spy on kids. And then you get into the next chapter, the sordid history and deadly consequences of sex ed at school. But we look at this, the Big Brother data that's happening, spying on your children, spying on us, and so forth. You go into all these different things.
Yep. And they're gathering data on children and families that people could not even imagine, Tom. Hundreds of data points now. They're monitoring your children's mental health, their dental health, their nutrition, right? They're giving them surveys, asking about life at home. How does your dad talk to your mom? Does anybody smoke in your house? What kind of food do you have in the refrigerator? What are the political beliefs of the family? I mean, it's so intrusive. And I actually have U.S. Department of Education reports going back over a decade where they're bragging about all this data that they're harvesting. And it's things that people couldn't even comprehend, right? I've got a U.S. Department of Education report from 2012 where they brag about these new technology tools they have, like a facial expression camera. And they say it'll monitor the facial expressions of children as they're exposed to different stimuli and then determine what kind of reaction, what kind of response they had to the stimulus. And then that will be fed through an algorithm. They didn't mention artificial intelligence, but AI is a part of this now. And it will determine whether this child needs an intervention. So they've moved past academics now. They don't even pretend to care about academics now. They're worried about social emotional learning, what they call the affective domain. Does your child have the right attitudes, values, and beliefs? And the way they do this is they come up with the preordained view that they want your children to have. Say on abortion. They want your children to believe that killing babies is good. We should all be killing babies. There's too many people on the planet anyways. They're an inconvenience. Free sex requires that we be able to kill our babies. And so they start off with the position that your child must know that killing babies is good. And then this technology will start finding out where they're at. So maybe it'll show a picture of an unborn baby or something like that to try to determine what kind of reaction they have. And this is fed through the system. And if your child has the wrong reaction, and it could be anything, immigration, homosexuality, transgenderism, you name it. If your child has the wrong reaction, then the system, without even any intervention from the teacher, will circle back and try a new way to get your child to have the right view or attitude on this particular issue. And then these reports say from over a decade ago, Tom, that by the time this is done, they're going to have all this data and they're going to use it to predict the future behavior, attitudes, values of your children. This is right in their reports from over a decade ago. In 2019, the UN hosted in Beijing, of all places, the Artificial Intelligence in Education Conference. They're telling you that they're going to use AI and technology not just to monitor everything your children do and think, but to manipulate those things. So take what Pavlov did with the dogs, where he conditioned them to salivate when they heard the bell. Take that, apply it to different attitudes and values, and recognize that they're 1,000 times more sophisticated than that now. And for the parents out there who think, well, I'm just going to unbrainwash my child at dinner. I'm just going to send my child to Sunday school and I'll be able to counter. No way. These people brag that in 15 minutes they can undo everything parents did in 15 years, ladies and gentlemen. So I don't care how good of a Christian you are. I don't care how sophisticated you are. I don't care how much you talk to your kids. These people are incredibly smart. They are using incredibly advanced technology and incredibly advanced psychological and even psychiatric interventions to bring your children over to their side. And by the time this is done, Tom, we've got this data from the Nehemiah Institute. Something like 80 to 90% of Christian children from Christian homes who go through the public school system are going to leave the faith and leave the church. So this is an existential crisis for the church in America. It's an existential crisis for our families. And frankly, I believe it is one of the most important issues facing Christians today.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a shame that pastors aren't standing up and preaching the truth. Again, thinking these things are political, they're not. And we are fighting for our children. What kind of person isn't going to fight for their own children? Especially someone who claims to be a Christian, and then have pastors who refuse to get involved in this. To me, it's troubling because I am a pastor. I've been a pastor for almost 30 years. And look at this and just think, it's just absolutely terrible. I want to get into the homeschool thing in just a second, but before my next question, everybody, I want to encourage you, check out everything Alex has. Alex, you're on OAN with Allison Steinberg every Friday, is it?
That's right. Yep. Every Friday. And it's a great blessing. Allison is an incredible journalist, an incredible woman of God. And she's really one of the clearest voices for truth in the modern media landscape. So it's a great honor to be on there. I know you're on there regularly as well. And folks, check it out. I mean, it's worth the price of an OAN subscription just to watch Allison's show. And there's other really good ones on OAN as well. So
yeah, it is. So Alex is on there once a week. And then also you have your own programs. You have Liberty Sentinel, the New America. You have so many different things. How can people find you?
So I do a free newsletter that we put out twice a week. People can find it at libertysentinel.org. Sentinel is Sentinel for those of us who didn't learn how to read properly in public school. Sentinel. I'm senior editor at the New American Magazine. We also put out a free daily newsletter with the top headlines. We have a printed magazine. I have a 3 times weekly television show that you've been kind enough to join me on several times. That's called the Sentinel Report. We do post all those at my website, libertysentinel.org, or people can watch them on any one of 7 or 8 different TV networks that carry it, lots of AM, FM stations, and all the big podcasting platforms. And then I have a nationally syndicated radio show called Behind the Deep State and Conversations That Matter. That goes out over a few hundred stations each weekend. But the easiest place is just my website, libertysentinel.org, or people can follow me on Twitter, on X. It's Alex Newman _JOU.
Yeah. Excellent. And by the way, tomorrow, everybody, J.B. Hickson will be joining me live. It's going to be a great program. And I want to also ask you, before we get to the next question, if you would like and subscribe to this channel. And it helps with the algorithms. Believe me, it might sound trivial to you guys. It doesn't cost anything. But just to do that, it really helps us to get the truth out there. And the things that Alex is sharing today are what we need. And you might be thinking, I don't have any kids or grandkids. Listen, this is a battle for our nation. It's a battle for children. It's a battle for lives. Think of Revelation chapter 18, where one of the judgments God brings upon Babylon is that they were selling the bodies and souls of men, marketing them. Folks, that's happening right now. We live in this Babylonian system. It is happening right now. Alex, so somebody had asked a question about homeschool. And they said, I can't homeschool. What would you suggest?
Well, I do believe that homeschooling is the gold standard, but I don't believe it's the only legitimate alternative that God has given us. I'll start off by talking about why I think it's so important. Parents are the ones called to raise, educate, and disciple their children. And this is clear over and over and over again in the scriptures. I think the clearest biblical model for what this looks like comes out of Deuteronomy, actually. So God told his people this very, very early on. Deuteronomy chapter 6, Deuteronomy chapter 11, God outlines kind of what a real education looks like. And he says, you ought to be teaching your children about God and his laws when you wake up in the morning, when you're walking by the way, when you're sitting down, when you're going to bed at night, right? You're supposed to be teaching your children all the time. But the reality is God's given us a lot of liberty, right? God allows us to delegate some of these responsibilities. Ultimately, we're accountable, right? Ephesians 6, verse 4 tells us we as parents, we are to bring up our children in the fear, the discipline, the admonition, and the instruction of the Lord. But how exactly we do that, he doesn't lay it out in perfect detail. So I say, if you want to get together with a co-op, if you want to send your child to a good Christian school that you have vetted thoroughly, if you want to get together with a group of families and share the responsibility, if you want to leave them at grandma and grandpa's house 2 days a week and then send them to a co-op another 2 days a week. I serve on the board for an online K-12 Christian school called Freedom Project Academy. Very, very cheap, and we have scholarships for families that can't afford it. I serve on the board. Actually, I'm the volunteer executive director for Public School Exit. You can find us at publicschoolexit.com. We'll give you money if you're a genuinely low income person who can't afford to get your. We just had a big fundraiser at Mar-a-Lago a couple of weeks ago. We're trying to raise money for this, but we understand there are people who quite literally cannot afford to do what God calls us to do. So we want to come alongside them and help them. We do believe that churches should be helping this. But long story short, I think there's a lot of ways we can honor God and obey God in the education of our children. But I'd point you back to Proverbs. And this is really the litmus test that you ought to look at for any kind of education that you provide for your child. Proverbs 1:7, Proverbs 9:10, right? Both of these speak crystal clear to what a legitimate education looks like. And I don't believe any education that does not include these things should be considered a valid education. So Proverbs 9:10, God tells us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. If you go to Proverbs 1:7, it says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. In other words, the fear of the Lord is the foundation upon which all the rest of your education is going to be built. You know, you could study what the fear of the Lord means for months and years and never fully understand the depth of it. But that's the starting point, right? God doesn't say you need 25 credit hours of science or math to have a good education, but he does say the fear of the Lord is essential. We all know there is zero fear of the Lord being instilled in the minds of children in government schools. In fact, John Dewey and his buddies, one of his buddies who signed the Humanist Manifesto, outlined their plan. He said, his name was C.F. Potter, he said in the book, Humanism, A New Religion, that what is your Sunday school going to do 1 hour a week against 5 days of humanistic teachings? And the answer was, of course, nothing, right? So we've got to have an education for our children that is based on God's principles. And I would remind people of one more thing that the scriptures teach, well, two more things, if I may, Tom. The first is in Mark chapter 12. Jesus tells these, and it's in a different context, but I think it's just as applicable here. Jesus says to them, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. And so, you know, if you are under the delusion that your children belong to Caesar, by all means, let them, you know, do what they do. But if your children belong to God, which they do, then you need to take what he thinks about this real seriously. And I'll add, one more from Jesus Christ, our Lord, our Savior. He's quoted twice in the Gospels, in Matthew and in Luke. Matthew chapter 12, verse 30, it says, whoever's not with me is against me. And so I would just encourage parents, is the education that you're providing to your children with Christ? Because if it's not, there's only one other option. And frankly, I do believe God's going to hold us responsible and accountable for this. You know, in past generations, you could claim ignorance. You know, before 1962, 1963, you could say, hey, they're still reading the Bible every once in a while. They're still praying. You know, maybe they are with Christ. You can't say that anymore. So moms, dads, you know, pray about it. I'm not trying to sound accusatory or mean, but the fate of your children is absolutely critical. God gives you instructions for this. No Christian education won't save the souls of your children. Jesus Christ saves the souls of children, but God gave us clear instructions. 1 John, right, if we really love him, we will obey him. And our first ministry that God has given us is to our families.
Amen. That was excellent. Also in this book, again, everybody, this book is available in the Hope for Our Time store, but you have Trading Academics for Far Left Social Emotional Learning. Certainly, we've seen that schools using fake history to kill America. Another chapter, CCP virus ushers in brave new world of techno-utopian education. I mean, there's more here. Weaponizing schools with critical race theory, totalitarian agenda behind the LGBT sex ed revolution of schools, and more. Folks, this is just an outstanding book. You know, I encourage you to get it. Alex, thank you for joining me today. I'm looking forward to the conference that we're going to have on the sea. It's going to be absolutely terrific. Dr. David Reagan's going to be joining us, Bill Koenig and Jeff Kinley, and looking forward to meeting all of you who are going to be going with us. And again, everybody, check out everything that Alex has. Sorry about some of the tech problems we were having there. Sometimes these things happen, especially when we go live. That is one challenge with going live. But again, Alex, great to see you. I look forward to seeing you in the very near future. And God bless you. And thank your wife and your family for sharing, for allowing you to share the time with us today. God bless you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Tom. Really appreciate you. God bless you. Looking forward to the cruise, and thank you again.
Bye, everyone.